The Great Tribulation is a very important subject. What you believe about the Great Tribulation, whether you realize it or not, will affect how you view all other end-time events. In Christian eschatology, the Great Tribulation is a short and intense period of time that will come just before the return of Jesus at the end of this age. Jesus issued a strong warning about this future Great Tribulation in Matthew 24:21, where he said, "For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." In this verse, Jesus made the statement that the Great Tribulation will be the worst time of tribulation that will ever occur on the face of the earth for all time, past, present, and future. The words Great Tribulation in the original Greek text are thlipsis megale, and the meaning is just as it is usually translated, great trouble, tribulation, and oppression, which involves direct suffering. There have been many instances of tribulation throughout the history of mankind, countless wars and conflicts that have resulted in immeasurable suffering, and many of those past tribulations are even recorded in the scriptures themselves. In recent history, the staggering number of people who perished in World War II is said to have exceeded 50 million. But the future Great Tribulation at the end of this age is different. According to Bible prophecy, the loss of life will even exceed that of World War II. In fact, when you consider what Jesus said in verse 22 of the same chapter, you start to get a sense of how bad the Great Tribulation is actually going to be. It says, "Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." In this video, we are going to explore what the Bible has to say about the Great Tribulation and answer some important questions that you may have, like, what exactly is the Great Tribulation? When does it begin? When does it end? How long will it last? Is the Great Tribulation found in the book of Revelation or in the writings of the Old Testament prophets? And of course, the most controversial question of all, will Christians still be here during the Great Tribulation period? The Bible reveals the answers to all of these questions. You just need to know where to look. But as we move forward, remember, there's no need for us to be afraid of what the Bible says about end times. Rather, we should embrace it, because the good news is, not only did Jesus warn us ahead of time about the Great Tribulation at the end of this age before he returns, but the Bible reveals many interesting details about it, and it's in those details where we will find our answers. So let's begin reading Matthew 24, verses 15, 16, and 21, skipping over the verses in between, not because those verses aren't important, because they are, but just so we can stay in the flow of what Jesus was saying here. "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." The reason Jesus is warning those in Judea at that future time to flee to the mountains is because he wants them to escape the Great Tribulation that will be about to start. And what he said to watch out for so that they will know when it's about to start is the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. We are going to investigate exactly what this abomination of desolation is as we move forward. But let's take a look at this holy place first. The holy place Jesus is referring to here is the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. In fact, they were looking at the temple right then as Jesus was talking to them. The first verse of this chapter tells us that they were all up on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples were admiring the temple. And Jesus had just told them in verse 2 that the temple was going to be destroyed, which it actually was about 40 years later by the Romans in 70 AD. And it has not been there ever since then. But the abomination of desolation event did not happen in 70 AD. What does all this mean? Well, it means that at the time of the end, the Jewish temple must be there in order for the abomination of desolation event to occur. One of the great signs that we are living in the time of the end will be when the Jewish temple is rebuilt. It seems impossible, I know. Just a side note on this, I believe one of Satan's biggest schemes to stop God's plan from coming to pass is to try to stop the rebuilding of the temple. Satan has used the false religion of Islam to create the explosive political and religious environment in the Middle East for this exact reason. But in spite of all this, God's plan will prevail. Going back to the abomination of desolation in verse 15, Jesus added the words spoken of through Daniel the prophet. This shout out to Daniel was a signal for them as well as for all of us to go investigate what Daniel said about this. And since it's the abomination of desolation event that triggers the Great Tribulation, if we can find out when the abomination of desolation event begins, then we can also know when the Great Tribulation will begin. Daniel was a prophet, and he wrote about this abomination of desolation in two primary places. Daniel chapter 9 verse 27 and chapter 12 verse 11, which we are going to look at in just a minute. The 9th chapter of Daniel establishes a framework of 7 years at the end of the age, and most of the events of the book of Revelation will unfold during that 7 years, including our topic today, the Great Tribulation. Without this framework of 7 years, it simply would not be possible to develop a structured timeline of end-time events. Many of the events predicted in the book of Revelation have timing indicators associated with them, and those timing indicators help us to place those events in the right location within the 7-year framework. Daniel's 70th week is a term that is used when referring to this 7-year framework. This 7 years represents the last 7 years leading up to the start of Jesus establishing his 1,000-year reign on earth. Before we look at those two verses, here's just a quick overview of the 9th chapter of Daniel. In Daniel 9:2, Daniel started praying to God, asking him what was to become of the Hebrew people. They had sinned against God, and as a result, they had been in captivity in Babylon for almost 70 years up until then. In Daniel 9:22, the archangel Gabriel is sent by God to give Daniel insight and understanding about all of this. Gabriel says to Daniel, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people. In Hebrew, the word for weeks is shavua, which means 7. So 70 sevens would be a better way to understand what Gabriel had said. Simple math tells us that 70 sevens equals 490. And in the context of the entire chapter, it's clear this is referring to 490 years. Verses 22 to 26 go on to explain that of the 70 weeks, or 70 sevens, or 490 years, 483 years have been completed, and now there's only 1 week, or 1 7, or 7 years remaining. Now that we have established all of that, let's look at the first part of Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Speaking of the Antichrist, it says, "He will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to the sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate." The Antichrist, the one who makes desolate, will make a firm covenant with the many. The many, for the most part, is probably referring to the people of Israel, although most likely other nations will also be involved in this firm covenant. It says that the Antichrist will make this covenant with them for 1 week. As I mentioned earlier, 69 of the 70 weeks have already been completed. So the 1 week in this verse is the final week, the 70th week, what we like to call Daniel's 70th week. And it represents the final 7 years that lead up to the end of this age when Jesus begins his 1,000-year reign on earth. Looking at verse 27 again, it says, "And he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to the sacrifice and grain offering." The sacrifice and grain offerings are things that can only be carried out in the holy place or the temple. In the middle of the week, or in the middle of the last 7 years, the Antichrist will stand up in the temple and put a stop to the temple activities of sacrifices and grain offerings. This is why the Jewish temple must be there for this to happen. Remember, this is what Jesus said to watch for as a sign that the Great Tribulation is about to start. But Daniel says it happens in the middle of the week, or in the middle of the last 7 years. I cannot express enough how valuable this little piece of information is. Because of this one verse, we know three major things. First, we know the framework for many of the end time events is 7 years. Second, we know that in the middle of the 7 years, the Antichrist goes into the temple to stop the sacrifice and grain offerings. And third, we also know that the Great Tribulation that Jesus warned about will start in the middle of the last 7 years, but not in the exact middle. You see, in this verse, the word middle in Hebrew is chatzi, not chachi like Fonzie's cousin, but chatzi, and it actually does mean half or middle. There are several Old Testament verses that use this Hebrew word in a very precise way, as in Exodus 26 verse 16 and 36 verse 21, where it is used in measuring a half of a cubit. But other verses like Judges 16:3, where Samson got up in the middle of the night, and Psalms 102 verse 24, where David asked God that he would not die in the middle of his days, the word katsi is used in an imprecise manner. So when Daniel 9:27 says the Antichrist will stop the sacrifice and grain offering in the middle of the week, I don't believe this happens in the exact middle of the week. In fact, I will now show you that the abomination of desolation event happens exactly 30 days before the exact middle of Daniel's 70th week. Let me explain. The book of Revelation splits the last 7 years into two halves, and here's how. Revelation 11 verse 3 says, "And I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1260 days. These 1260 days equals the first 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week." And then Revelation 12:6 says, "Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1260 days." These 1260 days equals the last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week. And there's more. Revelation 11:2 mentions 42 months, which equal the first 1260 days of the last 7 years. In Daniel chapter 7 verse 25, chapter 12 verse 7, and Revelation 12 verse 14 all mention a phrase, "a time times and a half a time," of which there's widespread agreement that this phrase equals 3.5 years in reference to the last 1260 days of the last 7 years. In other words, the Bible overtly and repeatedly splits the last 7 years into two halves, 1260 days for the first half and 1260 days for the second half. And now this brings us to Daniel 12:11. Read this with me carefully. It says, "From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be," wait for it, 1290 days. This is surprising, right? You'd kind of expect it to say 1260 days. So what gives? To be sure, this isn't an error in the text or a typo. All of the Hebrew manuscripts match up, and they all say 1290 days. What is the reason for the extra 30 days in this verse? Well, the verse itself tells us everything we need to know. The 1290 days end right at the end of Daniel's 70th week. If you go to the end of the last 7 years and count backward 1290 days, you end up at 30 days prior to the exact middle of the last 7 years. Let's look at it again. From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1290 days. Not the exact middle, but 30 days before the exact middle. When we put Daniel 9:27 and 12:11 together, we know the framework at the time of the end is 7 years. And we know that at precisely 30 days before the exact middle of the 7 years, the Antichrist goes into the temple to stop the sacrifice and grain offerings. And then we also know that the Great Tribulation begins 30 days prior to the exact middle of the 7 years. Why do we go through all that? We needed to uncover the framework that the Bible reveals about the last 7 years. Most of the events of the book of Revelation fit within this 7-year period. And as we locate the timing indicators for those other events, we will have an easier time placing those events in the right place within the 7-year timeline. One of the greatest controversies in relation to Bible prophecy is, as you probably know, over the timing of the rapture. Does the rapture happen at the beginning of the 7 years, or in the middle of the 7 years, or at the end of the 7 years? Seeing the timing of when the rapture will occur is a lot like trying to see the sun. You can't see it if you look directly at it, but if you look just to the left or to the right, there it is. In this same way, as we begin the process of looking at the other events of Bible prophecy and placing them in the right place within the framework of the last 7 years, the location of the rapture is just there and becomes obvious. Getting back to Matthew 24, verse 21, where Jesus said that there will be great tribulation, Jesus went on to say in verse 22, "Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." Obviously, those days are referring to the days of the Great Tribulation. Unless those days of the Great Tribulation are cut short, no life would have been saved. This brings up two questions then. Exactly how short will the Great Tribulation be, and what is it that cuts it short? As stated earlier, the Great Tribulation will be a time of great distress, especially for the people living in Israel at the time, because the Antichrist will attempt to destroy all of Israel at that time. Knowing this, in verse 16, Jesus tells them to flee to the mountains to escape. Remember, these are Jews, and while they don't believe Jesus is their Messiah yet, they do believe that the Messiah will come to save them. Then, in verse 23, he tells them, "Then if anyone tells you, 'Behold, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe him." Essentially, Jesus warns them of the Antichrist's plan to draw them out of hiding so that he can destroy them, and says don't believe it, because that is not how the Messiah will come. And then in verses 27 to 30, he tells them how he will come and save them and cut the Great Tribulation short. "For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. And then all of the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of the sky with power and great glory." The Great Tribulation begins 30 days before the exact middle of the last 7 years. Jesus appears in the clouds in the sky 30 days later in power and great glory in the exact middle of the last 7 years to cut the Great Tribulation short and to save Israel from total destruction and to destroy the armies of the Antichrist. The Antichrist will, however, regroup after this and assemble the armies of the world again at the end of the 7 years for the Battle of Armageddon. At the time of his appearing, in the exact middle of Daniel's 70th week, the rapture takes place. The remnant Jews of Israel who survive will see Jesus, him whom they have pierced, when he appears, and receive him as Messiah, but not in time for them to go up in the rapture. Well, that's all for today. Join me next time for part 2 of the Great Tribulation as we continue this study.